the strategic design of a conversation when it comes to podcasting is what creates this intimacy and this connection with your listeners and gets them to want to keep coming back.
Most hosts never achieve the results they hoped for. They're falling short on listenership and monetization, meaning their message isn't being heard and their show ends up costing them money. This podcast was created to help you grow your listenership and make money while you're at it. Get ready to take notes. Here's your host, Adam Adams.
Hey, podcaster, it's your host, Adam A. Adams, and I'm stoked to have a great guest today. And the problem, there's only one problem. I think we could do a dozen episodes with her, or at least 9, at least close to a dozen of just unique things. And we may or may not cover lots of stuff. So I want you to have a pen and paper ready. If you're driving, maybe listen to it again, because honestly, there's so much that's going to come at you, and it's going to come so fast that I believe that if you're taking notes, it will be a little bit better. So we've got Melanie Benson, who actually started one podcast, let it go, started another podcast, booming success, like massive success. The numbers on this podcast are incredible. 350 episodes as we're recording now, well over 100 ratings and reviews, which, by the way, listen to this, 0.6% of all podcasts in our world. There's 5 million podcasts. 0.6% of them, not even a percent, not even 1%, not even 1 out of 100 has 100 ratings or reviews. And she's got like well above that. And she also recently started another podcast with a co-host. And so some of the things that I want to discuss with Melanie Benson today is how she gets some of the length of the episodes, how she interviews. She says she likes to hone in on her inner Oprah. And I know she's a great interviewer because she's able to be concise with her episodes. I want to talk about how a podcast works with her business because her show does that. I want to talk a little bit about how she's growing her podcast because that main podcast, Amplify Your Success, it has amplified success as a podcast itself. Talk about the 2 podcasts. Is it good? Is it bad? Talk about solo casting, co-hosting, how to title episodes, and maybe some of the failures that she's seen so that you don't have to go through that. And what she does as a business owner, she supports entrepreneurs like you and me, how to stand out in a crowded market. Right now, we have so many influencers, so many people that are making noise, and it makes it difficult for your perfect avatar, your perfect person that you want to work with you, to choose you over the dozens and dozens of other people that they see all day, every day on social media and on podcasts, just like yours. So how do you stand out? So we're going to get through a little bit of this, and it's going to be fun. So grab a pen, grab a pencil, a paper, and let's dive in. Melanie, first and foremost, I was looking at your 2 different podcasts, and I was noticing something that was pretty much almost a stamp. You know how when you have a stamp, like a rubber stamp, every single time something looks almost the same. Now, you could put that stamp in a different color, and it'll look that color. But what I mean is almost every episode's in that 20 to 30 minute mark. My episodes are not like that. The listener might think that they need to do this length or that length, but I want to discuss the length of an episode with you for a little bit. And there's a lot of questions around it because sometimes it's easy to go over when you're having a good time or when you're asking extra questions. And so my first question about the length of an episode is like, do you have a timer, or how is it that you're getting all these so consistently like a rubber stamp?
Such a great question. And thanks for having me, Adam. You have such an awesome podcast. I've been very much looking forward to our conversation today. So I've studied neurolinguistic programming as part of my career track. And one of the things about neurolinguistic programming is there's a concept of being in time or through time. And I am the person who, it's through time. I can see where I am in time at any given moment. And because I can see where I am in any given time, I'm really good at managing time. So that's the truth of it. And We were talking in the green room a bit about my background with podcasting. I've been podcasting since 2009, 2010, something like that. And before that, I did the OG type of podcasting before we invented it, where I did interviews that would go out via CDs. And so I've been interviewing people for a very, very long time, close to 20 years. And one of the things I know is that the strategic design of a conversation when it comes to podcasting is what creates this intimacy and this connection with your listeners and gets them to want to keep coming back. It's what gets them to say, hey, have you listened to this podcast? Or, hey, do you know Melanie? Like, have you ever listened to Amplify? Because so the strategic design of each episode comes down to how long does my audience tend to listen to podcasts? And there is science that says 20 minutes to 25 minutes is an ideal time slot. Now, just to be totally truthful and make sure everybody has the full picture, my solo episodes, because I do 3 types of episodes on my podcast, Amplify Your Success, my solos are about 20 minutes because like nobody wants to hear you talk for a really, really long time, right? Well, maybe some people do, like Joe Rogan maybe, but
I feel like everyone wants to hear me talk a lot.
Oh, yeah, of course, because you have like that sexy radio voice. So of course you would, right?
No. All right. Awesome. So people just turn off after a little while? Well,
they get distracted. So let's say I'm driving my kids to school and I listen to podcasts. I got a 15-minute drive. Or I'm on my walk. What is that arc of the time that they're going to listen? I'm at the gym. At about the 20 to 25-minute mark, people start getting distracted. And the key is, do they pick back up where they left off? Or do they skip to something else? Like most of us have this shiny object syndrome always pulling us to the next thing. And so I found that 20, 25-minute mark is sweet for my solos. But with my interviews, sometimes we're going 40 to 45. And it's just, can you create a compelling conversation that keeps the listener engaged?
Yeah. So when you schedule an interview, do you tell the guest that it's going to be 20 to 25 minutes? Do you tell the guest to be ready for an hour, but I'm going to try to keep it under 30? Or like, is there a communication there prior to recording? What does that look like?
I'm really big on pre-framing expectations. And I think the more we can tell people what to expect, the better the experience is going to be for everybody. So I tell people that we're planning for 45 to 50 minutes for our conversation, but that means we're going to be connecting a little bit. We're going to be testing your tech. And I try to keep the interview to air at around 30 to 35. And then I even do that when I'm in the green room with them. And I'm like, okay, I just want to make sure you know we're going to go this long. If we're on a roll and it's really like good stuff, we might go a little bit longer, but I try to help them understand how to navigate their answers so that they can think about how long am I going in the answer itself so that they're measuring their own information sharing.
You're not saying in 54 seconds, how do you do this? Or in 31 seconds, how do you do that?
No, but I might say if we're running close and there's something I really want to ask them, because I always save 2 fun questions for the end of my episodes.
Oh, okay.
And so my audience knows that the fun question comes towards the end. And the people that love those types of answers, they're going to listen. And so if I have a really, really great question I want to ask them, or there's something that's important to get out they haven't talked about yet, I might say, okay, I got to ask you one more question. You got to cover it in like a minute because we got to get to the next piece. So I might say something like that.
Yeah. And so, you are able to keep it down to a certain amount of time because you have this inner time clock. And B, I'm curious on just interview tips. I might be a new podcaster, and I still say if you've been doing it for a year or 2, you're probably still new, especially with Melanie. When you've been interviewing people for 20 years, it didn't just take you 1, 2, 3 years to be perfect, right? You still were growing after that.
Whenever I want to learn a new skill, I either take a training, hire a coach, or study the best results of people that I'm enjoying the experience they're creating. And so I did all 3 when I started doing interviews. And it's funny you ask this because I get a lot of people asking me, like, how do you be a good interviewer? I even actually created a little toolkit on it because it's like, it's amazing how many people don't feel confident yet in those skills. Yeah. And here's one thing to avoid. and a couple things to do to really make sure you're crafting that conversation that is compelling and keeps people wanting to come back. One, start with a do. Understand who your audience is. I think a common mistake is when you don't really know who your audience is, you don't necessarily ask the questions that your audience is curious about. So I think, what will my audience be questioning as they're listening to this guest? And then the second thing is I turn on my curiosity and I just get curious. It's like, okay, tell me more. Or sometimes people, guest experts, they hit the high notes and they don't really give enough detail. And so I'll say, so now I'm super curious. Like, give me an example how that would work, right? And some people don't really understand how to design the conversation so they can teach a little bit of their framework, which, by the way, little secret tip, that's how you monetize being a guest on other people's shows, is you want to make sure you weave in your framework somehow. And so I might say, tell me a little bit about the framework that you use. So I am just always thinking, what does my audience need to know to make them want to keep listening? So that's a couple of things that I think I've been told makes my interviews really interesting to the listener.
So two things to do. One of them is understand the audience. And the second is to turn on your curiosity.
Turn on your curiosity.
Okay. So understand the audience and turn on your own curiosity.
Yeah.
And what about that one thing not to do?
Yeah. Well, and by the way, this all presupposes that you have done your research on the guest and you have an understanding of what they do in the world, right? I think that's a basic. Here's something to avoid. A lot of times people will craft a set of questions, or they might even ask their guest if you could share some questions you like to be asked. And where I see people go awry is they tend to ask these questions in a very monotone energy, and they're literally reading the questions. And there's no inflection in your voice. There's no change in tonality. There's no energy behind it. And they use transition words the same over and over and over again. So it might be like, awesome, Adam. So Adam, tell me about how you started your first podcast. Adam answers. Awesome. Adam, tell me, like, what is the favorite way that you interview guests? See, I can't even really do it, right?
I really hope I'm not doing that.
You
now
do
that
not
you're
do this.
saying this,
You
I'm
do
like,
not do it.
F, is she just like calling me out on my own show?
No, you are such a great interviewer. I listened to several of your episodes as we got ready for today. And like, you're a great interviewer. And by the way, no disrespect to anyone if you're like, oh my God, I do that. Like, we don't know until we know we could do it differently, which will get a better result, right? And so I share that because I hear all the time the guests going, oh my God, like, it was such a boring episode. I don't want to share it. And you want your guests to want to share it because they're proud of the interaction and what came out of it.
I really like that. It's interesting. So the one thing not to do, to be clear, is
read in a monotone format questions you want to ask.
Okay. Make sure that if it's a question that you're going to ask, that you're just asking the person. Like, I coach clients that do podcasts, just like on other things that they do. They'll come and they'll try to be really professional, like really scripted on their podcast, on their solos, just to be impressive. I think it's just, they really want to put on a good show. So they put on their like show voice. And I don't think that the show voice really resonates with very many people. Even you know how there's always the valedictorian? I wasn't one, but the valedictorian at your school graduation tends to have a speech. And when they have their speech, they're probably reading a speech. I grew up and I went to a church and they would let anyone speak. They would actually call on you and say, hey, do you want to speak? Now, I'm dyslexic and ADD and typically just have a hard time reading because if you're dyslexic, you've always hated to read. And so you don't practice reading. Therefore, reading in front of people gets a little bit more challenging. And so I would just have bullet points. Mm-hmm. And I remember, I don't think I was a great speaker or whatever. Like, I'm not giving myself any props. I'm just saying all I did differently was I had bullet points instead of reading. And so it could come from my heart. And because it came from my heart, I think it touched some people. And I remember at the end of every speech, people were like, you're so good. Like you do it differently than everybody else. And it was just probably because I wasn't reading, because I literally almost can't read.
So that's how you turned a weak energy into a strength, is like you had to come from your heart, right? And I think that's really what we're saying here is come from your heart, like bring your unique curiosity. This is where curiosity is your superpower.
That's a really insightful way to put it. And now I want to read a question. How does it work with your business? Okay, what I mean is...
Way to make a point, Adam.
How does your show, and maybe even your second show, correlate with how you support people standing out in a crowded market and making more money?
Well, my first show, Amplify Your Success, which is hosted by me and completely curated by me. All of my guests are handpicked. Even if they pitch me, I go through them all and I make sure they're a great fit. So how it fits into my business is twofold. I started my podcast with the vision that I wanted to have a podcast that would help amplify my own authority in the marketplace. And I wanted a tool that would educate my ideal client how I solve a problem for them, what the outcomes they could expect with me, that would bring content in a way that had that visibility advantage. It was just a bit of an edge over like a competition. And I wanted to create what I call the binge effect. I wanted a potential client to be able to binge me and go, she's my coach, or I want to go through one of her programs like 100K Authority Accelerator. Like I want to do something with her because I love the way she is.
Can I verify that I have both, or do I not have both? Do I only have one so far?
No, you don't have the second one.
Oh, okay. So all of that is part of the first one. Binge-worthy.
That's the strategy,
and how to solve a problem with an edge. Okay.
Yeah.
Keep going.
Multiple layers.
Okay.
But here's what happened after I started the podcast and I discovered the power of it is I wanted to grow my podcast. I wanted to attract more listeners. And one of the strategies to do that is to be a guest on other people's podcasts, other people's shows, and be introduced as a host. And what surprised me, but then became so valuable to me in the work I do with my clients is when I was a guest on someone else's show, they would come binge my podcast and raise their hand and go, hello, can you coach me? And so it became a lead nurturing strategy that would help me like, okay, they're not a good lead or they are a good potential client just simply by binging my podcast.
So if I sum this up, it's sounding like, and correct me if I'm wrong, Melanie, if I'm hearing you right, you've got two goals with your podcast. One of them is to connect with your guest by them coming on your show, you coming on their show, you getting to know them getting to know you and potentially working together. And another way that how your business works with your podcast or how your podcast works with your business is for the listener, you're helping them to be able to get value. And you're doing that in a few ways, but it's solving a problem, showing them, I call it drawing a line in the sand. So the other people that do serve a similar person is on that line and you're on this side of the line and you're showing basically what you do that's a little bit different and just making sure that it's binge-worthy. So the twofold is for the listener, A, and for the guest, B. Is that right?
Actually, not the guest. That was a third benefit that emerged later.
Okay.
My whole intention with my guest is to have valuable insights that go to my audience. But what I discovered was this was a great way to open up collaborations that could go beyond the podcast.
Okay, perfect.
So that's where the guest comes in terms of the opportunity. And it's like you have reciprocity. If you have a show, you have a way to give value, especially a good show. And that's really an asset that you can leverage in a lot of ways with other partnering situations.
Let's stay on. So we're talking about how does Melanie use her podcast for her business? And she's using it in two ways. One is to just help her listener. And the second one is really to get on other shows to be able to collaborate, to attract more listeners, and potentially also have the guests themselves work with her. But you mentioned, Melanie, that you want your podcast to be binge worthy. I think that the listener today understands that you need to solve a problem for your avatar. I think that the listener is pretty intuitive about with an edge? What sets you apart from the other people? The thing that I think sounds the hardest that you've shared so far is the bit about making it binge-worthy. And here I am getting my curiosity, like she said before, the two things to do. One of them is turn on the curiosity and have deeper questions, deeper insights. And my curiosity is going into this binge-worthy thing. And I'm hoping that I understand my audience, like Melanie said before, understand your audience. And I'm thinking of the same question that my listener is thinking. I want people to listen to more than one episode. I want people to be my true followers, true fan and connection. So what do you do, Melanie, to enhance that binge-worthiness?
Well, again, everything's very strategic with my podcast. Don't get me wrong. I love this podcast. I love the listeners. I love when people slide into my DMs and go, that was the best episode. Like, la, 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 la. This is what I loved about it. I mean, it brings me great joy to know that the content is making an impact. And I want my podcast to bring me clients and make me money. So when I design my episodes, I am designing them to really nail the issue that my ideal clients suffer with and are searching for an answer to, or is so intriguing that they're like, that's fascinating. I got to listen to that. And so the reason why I believe my podcast became bingeable is that I'm covering topics and I am handpicking guests that I think are really insightful, will deliver massive value. So sometimes they're more celebrity oriented. They've got a big name, they've got a big brand presence. And so there's going to be name recognition. And sometimes it's topic driven. They probably don't have a big brand name, but their topic is powerful. And I think it's going to get the audience listening. And my solo episodes are designed that as well. And little secret, and I think we might talk about this more later, my team keyword researches every episode title to help with organic search. So we're often creating titles that pop in the industry with the relevance, but also are things that people are searching for, which tells us, hey, we've got something that people want to listen to.
Where do they go to do the keyword research?
I am going to disappoint you here, Adam, and I'm so sorry. I have no idea because I've learned to delegate. And so I've delegated this completely.
I have used AnswerThePublic before.
Okay. That sounds familiar.
But
I think they might be using
that you might have another resource. Loving where we're going with this, and we're doing okay on time. So we're doing okay on time. Melanie, that doesn't mean you can have 17-minute answers. I need to lead you like you.
2 minutes. You got your timing down.
So next place that I really would like to go, you just mentioned briefly on interviews, solos, and coaching. You mentioned that you got the 3 different ways. You said, and on my interviews, I do it this way. So couple of questions. Does your team actually look up topics prior to you making solo episodes? Or after you make a solo episode and then they try to keyword research it?
I love this question, Adam. So my solo episodes emerge from coaching my clients on something or commonly asked questions. I have a Facebook group that's free to our community. And oftentimes people will ask questions in there. So I'm like, okay, this is on their minds. This is something that gets asked often. I'll create a episode around it. But we keyword research how to position it before I record it.
That's cool.
So yeah, Smart. It comes organically from the community.
Awesome. I got another question though about is the solo episodes emerge from your clients, like your coaching calls, your group calls, things like that. And this is, I think for the listener, more about social proofing. The question's headed around social proofing and whether you're using that or not. And where I want to go is, do you drop that? Do you mention that when you have that solo episode? Do you say specifically and intentionally, one of the clients that I work with asked this question, and then you phrase the question to show social proofing to your listener that says, Melanie works with people. Maybe I should work with Melanie. Maybe I'm that type of people that needs to work with her. Or do you just have the content without the social proofing?
Yeah, I love that you brought social proofing into this. So the way I do social proofing is typically and it depends on where the question came from, is I might say this came up in the Ignite Mastermind coaching call last week. And I was like, okay, cool. This would be something that everybody would benefit from. So I wanted to bring that knowledge here. Or the other way I like to do social proofing that I think has massive value, and I would love to hear as you're listening in today, if you take this and run with this and start to use it, wherever you're listening to this episode, give a little shout out and let Adam and I know that you're going to put this into action. And this is something you can do whether you host your own show or you guest on other people's show, is give examples of a client using a strategy you're teaching or having the breakthrough that you're explaining, and see if you can break it down into they had the problem. Here was the solution we worked on. Here's the outcome that they're experiencing. Because I find that kind of social proof is also a way that people go, I want that. Like, I'm reaching out to Melanie right now because I want to do that. And this is actually one of the common ways that I find people who are binging my podcast, when they get to the solo episode, like I did one on consistent visibility and how it actually brings profit to your business. And I had somebody go, I'm really bad at visibility strategies. Can I work with you? Is this something that you teach people? So yes, case study has a huge social proof impact as well.
Okay. So you do drop it like in my Ignite Mastermind group. Somebody had this question and I thought it would be good for everybody. So I want to bring it to you now. And then you also use stories about your clients and how they got through a problem by specifically talking about where they started, how they felt about it, and what overcame it. And that allows others to also say, I should hire her. Is that right?
Yes.
All right. My next question that I need to read, I'm going to say, awesome. And I'll read it dryly. My next question. I'm laughing too much. I can't find my question, Melanie. Is that a good or bad thing?
That's a good sign. I think that's good. Okay, listeners, do you like that part of what Adam's doing? Give Adam some love on that because we all love that.
So I'm curious about, they say if you have something that works, you shouldn't fix it. Have you heard that before too?
Yes. Don't fix what isn't broken.
Okay, you're probably saying it in the better way. So don't fix what isn't broken. If you had a podcast called Amplify Your Success and it was already a success and doing great, what had you decide that an additional podcast would be a good place to put your time and energy?
There's an interesting concept of leaning into a spark. And I'll tell you how my second podcast, Next Level Influence, was birthed. Back in the pandemic time, we had this platform come to life called Clubhouse. I co-hosted this with a few of my friends. So it became something that gave me a sense of connection to my community when I couldn't see anybody in person. And most of us quickly were like, okay, Clubhouse is not really where we want to be. It's not necessarily something we're going to continue to feed the machine, but we liked the energy. And in particular, Samantha Riley and I really had this vibe that we loved. And we wanted to continue having conversations that created a spark for our community. So, well, let's take those lives onto Instagram. Well, Instagram Live sucks. I'm sorry. It's just not a great platform for doing interviews and having conversations. It just didn't really work the way we imagined. So we're like, why don't we just do a podcast? Because people loved what was coming out of them because they could literally eavesdrop into a conversation with two very successful women and hear what's going on right now and how can I apply this into my business. So even though that's a newer podcast, it's actually been around for 3 years. And we've just taken a lot of those topics and repurposed them into the show. And the audience that we grow, it's never been about having the most successful podcast. It's been about the conversations that are sparking interesting conversations in our community. It's literally a passion project for both of us. It's not ever something we expected to monetize. It's never been like our key focus. It's really emerged from the spark of the deep connection and joy we feel when we are talking about things and how people are hungry to have access to those kind of conversations with mentors.
And on those episodes, if I remember correctly from the green room, you mentioned that you do a few different kinds. Like with your first podcast, Amplify Your Success, it was that you do some interviews, you do some solos, and you do coaching calls that might get shared as well.
Yes.
And on the second podcast, Next Level Influence, with two successful women, and you're having these conversations. I think I remember you doing a few different kinds, and I don't remember what they were, but I think two of them were just you and your co-host was one option. And another way that you recorded episodes was you, your co-host, and a guest or two. Is there other ways that you put out episodes with that podcast?
Yes. So there's a third. So we started with just her and I, and then there were subjects where we're like, we're not really the experts here, but who do we know that is? And we would invite a panel to have a dialogue about a subject. For instance,
like a panel.
Yes. And
one
then
guest?
we started bringing in one guest at a time, and we balance it. So there's no overarching theme of doing it one way. It's like, what are we inspired by? What do we want to learn about? What do we want to talk about? Because it's coming up in our coaching programs. And do we want to have a panel? Do we want to have a one person? So for instance, we did a series on AI technology. And we did a panel with women who were emerging as hot leaders in the AI content creation world, super successful. And we did a follow-up with a friend of ours who is a lawyer and legal advisor, and she's starting to specialize in AI content creation. So we did the flip side of like, okay, now what do you need to be aware of? So panel, interview.
Awesome. So those are the three. Okay, perfect. So lean into a spark. You wanted to make it happen, so you did it. Solo episodes or co-host is my next question. And I'm sorry I read that so dry. Solo episodes or co-host. What I'm curious about, I mean solo cast or co-hosted. And what that means is you've got your Amplify Your Success, which is basically you. Yeah, you might have a coaching call. It might be you and a coaching client. Yeah, it might be you and a guest, but it's you. And things change. And I think, in my own opinion, in my experience, and some of my clients' experience, things can get more challenging when you have a co-host who owns it. What happens if this happens? What happens if this happens? What happens when one person slows down or doesn't want to do it anymore? And what if one person's sick and the guest is still there? There's a lot to be thought of. And I'm wondering your experience as it relates to the listener who is new at this and maybe even about to launch a podcast. That listener might be thinking, wouldn't it be so much easier if I just had a co-host? It wouldn't just have to be me. I could play off of somebody else. Through your experience, Melanie, is it a good idea, a bad idea? What do we need to think of ahead of time before doing a podcast with somebody that their face is also on the artwork?
Yeah. This is a fabulous conversation to have, because to me, it's a lot like I need a business partner to complement my strengths because I can't do it all, right? And I believe that if you are building a podcast for business, it's really important to position you as the authority. And I think most people can have a podcast these days and not need a co-host. But there are some people, and I'm going to get a little woo for a second. I study human design. It's one of my secret fun things to do, is to really understand people's innate wiring and what makes them tick and how they express and how they're designed to be on this planet. And some people, the way they're designed, they do not feel confident with their articulating their message, and they don't feel like they can hold a space on their own. And so for those people who really need to be able to bounce back and forth and to create some energy and with a dialogue, I say get a co-host. But do not get a co-host unless you've really defined the role, the expectation, and the agreement. I mean, this is a business model. Like, define who's doing what and who owns what and what's going to happen if you guys depart ways. So even though this was a passion project with Sam, we talked it all through, and like, what are we going to do with all these assets if we decide to not do the podcast anymore? Because the friendship really is the more important piece of the puzzle there.
Hey, I've got a random follow-up question while talking about that co-host. And in this case, it's Sam or Samantha.
Sure.
Do you have a nickname, by the way? Do you ever go by Mel?
Yeah, sometimes. People call me Coach Mel a lot, which is why some of my social handles have Coach Mel in them.
Okay. Well, what I'm thinking, I had a couple of clients and the man went by Jim, and he always went by Jim, but on his artwork, he wrote James. And I suggested that he change it because if he's going to say, well, maybe I shouldn't say it, but if he's going to say this is Jim, or if his wife, who's co-host, is going to say, hey, Jim, and he never, ever gets called James, he doesn't relate as a James. I thought that there was something wrong. I felt like there was something wrong with him writing James. Like it was kind of like a different person if he didn't really relate to that person. And it sounded like he wanted it to be professional. But then if he wants it to be professional, then why doesn't he just go by James? And I'm curious about that because I see your artwork with Samantha and it's spelled out. But it feels like maybe 4 out of 5 times you called her Sam. So I'd like to get your thoughts on that same topic. Within our podcast artwork, the name that we go by, should it be our nickname, our legal name? Why or why not?
Well, if you were designing a podcast as part of an overarching business growth strategy, everything I teach around podcasting is about authority brands. What is your authority based on? My authority is based on Melanie. So I use Melanie, even though sometimes people give me the nickname of Mel. And as long as everything consistently brings Melanie Benson to the conversation and is published that way, then I think there's consistency. I think it's really insightful that you were noticing like this person goes by Jim, but now he's using James in his language. I'm sure most people would figure that out, but I am a huge fan of positioning your authority around the way you want to be known. So I think we can use nicknames. And I think most women named Samantha interchange Sam pretty easily. Like she goes by the Sam Riley on some of her socials. So there's an interchange there. It's probably a much longer story than we have time for. And I don't really know that I know all the details of why she interchanges between both.
Yeah, we are going to need to get you back on. And I just want to go through a couple things that you've taught us. The 2 things to do and the 1 thing not to do. Like read questions. You mentioned also that how it works with your business is twofold with your listener and the collabs, solo episodes, interview episodes, coaching, leaning into the spark, the co-host or solo host. And I just mentioned, like, I was going to ask about titling episodes, but you gave that about being bingeable, nailing the topics, handpicking the guest, and using good keywords. And it's something that I've noticed the entire time that you've been on is at the beginning, you said NLP. Toward the end, you said human design. And what I've been noticing about this NLP, and I'm loving it, is you use the word and but at the correct moments. And I would say that most people listening use but too many times when they mean and it does something wrong for their show and for the message. I definitely want to get you back on, and we will do the 2 fun questions at the end next time. I appreciate your time. For the listener, Melanie's information, her website, both of her podcasts, any social that she wants you to have is already in the show notes. Just scroll down, grab that. And I also recorded a bunch of really cool solo episodes. I go every other, by the way, Melanie, every other. I recorded a couple really cool solo episodes, and the very next episode about to happen is one that I think you're going to love. I will see you there. You know, I really don't say this nearly enough. I don't mention this, and I feel horrible because it's a great resource for you to be able to take your podcast to the next level. And it's simply a free resource that I don't need your email or anything. It's just a podcasting course that I created that is ended up putting in the very first 6 episodes of this podcast. So if you haven't checked it out, definitely going to want to just check out those first 6 episodes, see how they can help you improve your podcast, get in front of more people, and have a better result where you're making more money through the podcast, etc. So much can happen after you listen through episodes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So if you haven't done it, go do it now. And by the way, if you're subscribed, you'll keep hearing more great content. So to those of you who are, I'll see you on the next episode.